We would like to thank the sponsors and partners that made this event possible: the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa City Public Library, Prairie Lights, Iowa Public Radio, the Graduate Hotel, and Think Iowa City. Support was also provided by the Iowa Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The vast majority of book festival events are offered without charge, but they are not free. Please consider donating to the City of Literature by visiting iowacitybbookfestival.org and clicking on support. Today we will hear from authors Chris Jones and journalists Keith Schneider and Erin Jordan. Chris Jones has spent years researching and writing about Iowa's water quality. His book, Swine Republic, Struggles with the Truth About Agriculture and Water Quality, is a collection of essays that first appeared on his University of Iowa blog. The book explains how Iowa's politics, economics, and culture affect Iowa's water quality. Keith Schneider is a New York Times writer and senior editor and chief correspondent for Circle of Blue, the Traverse City-based network of journalists and scientists reporting on global trends affecting water, energy, and food. Erin Jordan is an investigative reporter for the Gazette in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City, where she covers agriculture, water quality, electric vehicles, and government accountability, among other topics. She also serves on the Investigate Midwest board and teaches at the University of Iowa Summer Journalism Workshop. Please join me in welcoming Chris Jones, Keith Schneider, and Erin Jordan.
Thank you, Rachel. And thanks to the Book Festival for hosting this conversation tonight. As Rachel said, I'm Erin Jordan with the Gazette. I've been at the Gazette for about 13 years, but been reporting in Eastern Iowa for about 20. Because I work in Iowa, and Iowa is the #1 producer of corn, pork, and eggs, right, Chris? Mm-hmm. Okay, and eggs. Agriculture and the environment is a big part of my beat. I've interviewed Chris many times over the years about water quality and the politics behind it. So tonight I have the pleasure of, I'm going to serve as kind of a moderator for this conversation with Chris and Keith. And in a minute, each of them will have a chance to kind of lay out more of the bones of what we want to talk about. But if you've seen the slips of paper from Keith, or from Steve, if you want to write down questions and raise them up, Steve will pick those up, and we'll take those in the last 20 minutes or so of our conversation tonight. So please submit those for us. So go ahead, Chris, if you want to start off.
Well, first I want to thank Erin and Keith, my good friends, for coming with me tonight. And when I do my book readings, I really detest reading from my book, and I am always sort of astonished that anybody would want to hear me read anything. And so I think when I do these events, it's people just want to talk to me and ask questions and discuss the state of affairs here in Iowa when it comes to water quality and the environment. And I think Keith has done some really incredible writing about this recently, in recent months. He interviewed me back in April about the time I was retiring, and he's written some really important pieces, I think, on the connection between human health and production agriculture here in the Corn Belt. And so I thought he would be a good one to have here tonight with me, and you folks would find him interesting, and I'm sure some of you have probably heard me talk. And so here's a sort of a fresh injection of energy here to help me tonight.
Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I'm really thrilled to be here. And I think this is my third trip this year to Iowa City to doing a major investigation on farm nutrient contamination in water across the Corn Belt. I don't think I need to tell you, but I'm going to tell you that Iowa is like ground zero for this problem, which I call a national scandal. This is a national scandal. The agricultural, and let me just also say, I got nothing, I respect agriculture. I respect farmers. I mean, what farmers do in this country is unbelievable, and the industry that they built is efficient and productive and scientific, and I mean, the kind of investment in brains and mechanical features and how the whole thing comes together is pretty miraculous, and it's one of the foundations of our country. I'll say that. but it's also the biggest polluter. It's by far the biggest polluter of air and water, especially in the nation. It is the biggest polluter that we've ever had, industrial polluter in the United States. It's bigger than coal. It's bigger than steel. It's bigger than chemicals. It's bigger polluter than any industry that we've ever had in the United States, particularly now, and it's principally unregulated. And that's the scandal of it. What farmers can put on the ground and what livestock and poultry producers can put on the ground is essentially unregulated. So imagine New York City, people in New York City, putting their wastes, urine and fecal wastes, untreated, spread on the land, okay? Well, there are 14 times, if the population of your animals and poultry is 14 times the human population in New York. And that's being spread on the farmland just in Iowa, untreated, largely unregulated. And I'll conclude with one more point. I've been looking at this for now almost 2 years. In the Midwest, around the Great Lakes, on phosphorus, and now nitrogen nitrate contamination in the Corn Belt. Agriculture is a $1.6 trillion industry. $1.6 trillion industry in the United States. Livestock and poultry producers are large enough to be able to regulate their discharge, their water discharges. And farmers are certainly wealthy enough at this point to be able to do a much better job in controlling and managing and being responsible and accountable for their fertilizer and manure. And I'll stop there.
All right, got a lot of good stuff to dig into here. Chris, when I interviewed you last spring about your book, you told me, quote, "The environmental problems we have here are not unique to Iowa. What is unique to Iowa, I think, is the death grip the industry and the culture of agriculture has on the discourse about these problems." Can you share with us some examples of what you see this death grip looking like in Iowa?
Well, I think, I say it's a travesty we don't have any public land, or we have so little public land here in Iowa. And so I think about 2% of our land is publicly held, and we look what's happening in the legislature. Instead of trying to acquire more land for the public, the ag lobby is trying to get the state to divest itself of land because purportedly, young farmers can't get into the business, and so if we make some of these public lands available for farming, then these young farmers will have access to land. Well, the amount of public land that we have to divest is so small that, that's just a phony argument. And so, obviously the objective here is to get as many acres in production as possible. And so why? Is it because we need the grain? No, it's not because we need the grain. It's because if you've got an acre of land and it's a park or it's in forest or, whatever, in some natural condition, you're not selling seed on that land. You're not selling equipment to farm that land. You're not selling hauling services to haul the grain away. You're not selling grain drying for the grain coming off that land. You're not selling insurance, crop insurance for that land. Well, who sells crop insurance in Iowa? Well, Iowa Farm Bureau, right? And so, I think that with the situation with our public land is the most glaring example of this death grip that production agriculture has on the state.
Yeah, that's a great example. Iowa is among 12 states bordering the Mississippi River that have pledged to reduce nitrate and phosphorus going into the river by 45%. These excess nutrients create a zone of water in the Gulf of Mexico that doesn't have enough oxygen to support wildlife. But there's other problems with nitrate in the water closer to home. Keith, I was hoping you could tell us about your recent reporting about nitrate in drinking water and the research that shows its connection to cancer.
Yeah, well, you talk about a death grip, the nitrates in water. So since 1980 or so, the University of Iowa has led the research into the connection, the links between nitrate, exposure to nitrates in water and cancer in this state. And this state has a women's cancer study that's been decades in the making, and it has tens of thousands of people involved. And the findings of the cancers and the connections to nitrates in the water are pretty powerful, are striking. Well, there are other states where that's emerging. Nebraska. Nebraska has similar levels of nitrate contamination in groundwater, similar levels in surface water. There are tens of thousands of wells, drinking water wells, contaminated with elevated levels of nitrate. And Nebraska has the highest pediatric cancer rate west of the Mississippi. And the University of Nebraska is deeply involved in trying to figure out what that's about, if it's a nitrate and atrazine link, if it's a nitrate and pesticide link in water. I was in Minnesota during this project and discovered a cluster. I'm going to use that advisedly because it's not a scientifically confirmed cluster, but it was 12 people that had developed cancer in 4 families along a 1-mile stretch in Dodge County, which is south of Minnesota. And I went up to interview the folks, and they did talk to me, but the key to putting that story together was that the county documented nitrate contamination in well water from the 1980s forward. So they had really good data about what was in the water, and lo and behold, every one of those families, 12 cancers, 7 deaths, every one of the wells had elevated levels of nitrates in the water. Now, the federal limit, safety limit, is 10 parts per million. Science is now saying that 5 parts per million nitrate in water long-term exposure can be damaging to your health, can cause cancer. All these wells were 7 to 25 parts per million over the length of the people, the lengths. And I interviewed three men that all had cancer, who had developed cancer as young men along that road. So I put together this piece and then just laid in all this other data about from Iowa and from Nebraska and all the National Cancer Institute studies about this. Now, there's nothing definitive, right? Because trying to link cancer to a specific pollutant exposure is really hard. We know that radiation causes cancer. We know that benzene causes cancer. We know that asbestos causes cancer. The nitrate connection is powerful in my view, not confirmed, but you talk about a death grip. I mean, this is happening in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, and Missouri, where I've found evidence of this connection. So it's just, and the other thing about this is that the response from the the institutional response to this has been really slim to none. Iowa's about this. Minnesota, they weren't even tracking any of this. Nebraska is trying to get onto this. Wisconsin is doing a little bit better, but it's very slow. It's like nobody really is dramatically concerned about that. But think about this, and I'll stop with the next point. Water contamination across the entire Corn Belt is terrible. It's terrible. There's an elevated nitrate concentration in well water across the Corn Belt. There's elevated levels of nitrate contamination on the surface water. I took a bike ride in Solon, today. I carry my mountain bike with me, and I rode up there, and man, that lake is, there's algae all over that lake. And I'm thinking, wow, this is everywhere. I got concerned about this because this started to happen in my area of Michigan, northern Michigan. I'm like, what is going on with this?
So, you mentioned how it's difficult to prove that these cancer cases are connected with nitrate. It's not like the movie Erin Brockovich where, you go out and take one test sample and that connects all the dots, or, I'm sure that's simplified, but how do you hold polluters accountable in this situation? I mean, that for either of you.
Why don't you take this first?
Well, the problem, we have this strategy here, a voluntary strategy, right, where we try to appeal to farmers' sense of altruism and their obligation to society, and we hope that will work and that farmers will adopt practices that will reduce the pollution. And I think the issue here isn't that the pollution is coming from a small minority of farmers. It's coming from everywhere, right? It's everywhere, especially nitrate pollution. It's ubiquitous around the state. And so to try to pick off these farmers one by one and appeal to them, to their sense of altruism to solve this problem when there's 80,000 farmers, it's a fantasy, right, that we're going to solve it that way. And so because the pollution is coming from everywhere, we need laws. We need laws that address this. And, I like to say, what these people do, and they're not just the farmers, it's agribusiness too. What they do, it affects everybody. And if what you're doing affects everybody, then everybody should have a say in how you're doing it. And that means laws that we know would deliver better environmental outcomes. Will laws completely solve this system? No, we're going to need a more diversified system to get all the environmental outcomes that we want. But we know that some rules now would produce better water now.
We'll come back to that in a sec, but Keith, what would you
All right,
say about?
There's an opportunity to break through now. American agriculture, industrial agriculture is in this major transformation and pivot point at this moment. So the Biden administration and Congress in summer 2022 passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and it includes $319 billion for the climate provisions, okay? Half of that is for renewable energy. So that's solar, that's wind, that's geothermal, but it's also ethanol from corn and methane from manure. So just the methane pieces of it. And there's tens of billions of dollars going into this. So there's an opportunity, I think, to begin to regulate agriculture under the Clean Water Act point source provisions, right? So if you're a wastewater treatment facility like in Iowa City, you are regulated tightly about what you can put in the water across the board. And it's called point source. Agriculture is considered non-point source, and it's basically unregulated. But what's going to happen, what is happening in agriculture right now with the turning manure into methane is a linkages happening right now between Chevron, Exxon, major utilities, and others who are going to build and operate biodigesters and attach them to CAFOs, the livestock, big livestock, right, and produce methane. What comes out in that biodigester is a thing called digestate. It is a liquefied, concentrated manure, right? And it's not going to be regulated as a point source, even though it is a point source. It comes out of a pipe. Now, there is an opportunity to both close the loop on pollution from large livestock agriculture by arguing in court and others that that's a point source. And it's not farmers or farm companies that are going to be operating those biodigesters. It's the biggest industry, the biggest companies in the country. So if we can argue that this is an industrial, these are not farmers and those are not farms, those are energy producers, and that's a point source of pollution. And I think that this is a way to break through the impediment, the hegemony of agriculture, because we're not talking about family farmers here. Family farmers basically are not producing CAFOs, right? I mean, they're already industrialized and corporatized, right, everywhere. And they're going to be linking up with major regulated industries. So that's something that I'll be writing about more as I get an understanding of it.
Chris, what do you think, what do you think is some low-hanging fruit in terms of some laws that could be implemented?
Well, yesterday, as a matter of fact, I was fishing with Orland Love, who, former colleague of Erin's, outdoor writer for the Cedar Rapids Gazette, and he lives in this small town, Quasqueton, Iowa, and the Wapsipinicon River flows right through there, and so we were fishing on the Wapsi. And the Wapsi, the upper Wapsi, is probably our best stream in Iowa right now, and by that I mean the area above Independence. Well, what's special about it? The riparian area in the Wapsi is still intact. And so the areas along the stream are not being farmed, right? Well, that is the lowest of low-hanging fruit. We see all over Iowa, especially in the western half of the state, farmers farming right up to the brink of the stream, right? And so, it's Conservation 101, right? That we buffer our streams, that we should have perennial cover along the stream banks, the first 30 feet or the first 50 feet. Minnesota has a law, it's the first 50 feet. And so we have these really aspirational ideas that we're gonna have cover crops on half the acres, and we're gonna do no-till over a half or 70% of the acres. And I just wanna laugh at that stuff because we can't even do the basics, right? The basics, which are buffering streams. How on earth are we gonna get cover crops, on half the acres that it costs billions of dollars when we can't even get them to not farm right up to the stream bank? And so I would say requiring stream buffers on all perennial streams, 50 feet on either side of the stream, is probably the lowest of the low-hanging fruit.
Chris and I were talking before the session about how on these warm fall days, sometimes you can smell manure in the air, and it's a sign that it's being applied to farmland, this time of year. Do you think there's any room for further restrictions on when manure can be applied?
So when farmers say they don't have time to do stuff, that's a real thing. And so the climate here, as we know, is really dynamic and can change very rapidly and can go from hot to cold, pretty rapidly, right? And so you can't apply manure when there's growing crops in the field. And so the time window to get that stuff done, both in the fall and the spring, is short. But here's the problem. The way we've designed this modern production system is the issue. So at one time, 40 years ago, the average farmer in Iowa that raised hogs raised about 300. At that time, there was about 60,000 people raising hogs. Now we have about 5,000 people raising hogs, and the average number that they raise is about 5,000. So they've gone from an average of 200 to an average of 5,000. Well, all of a sudden, you've turned all this hog waste, it's what I call, we've made it hot, right? And so they have so much to manage that there's no margin for error in terms of getting the stuff applied and managing the pit where it's accumulating and transferring it from the pit to the equipment to get it onto the field. There's absolutely no margin for error, and so any slip up produces this catastrophic result, a fish kill in our stream. And so yes, the time windows are short. Well, why are the time windows short? It's because they have so many animals, right? And so we need a production system that's designed to give us the environmental outcomes that we want. Instead, we have one that's designed to produce maximum efficiency for the individual producers. That isn't what produces the environmental outcomes for us as the public.
And you got to understand that in 1972, when the Clean Water Act was passed, agriculture was given a waiver, a big waiver. If livestock agriculture was regulated for its waste stream the way a wastewater treatment plant, CAFOs would not be possible the way that this developed. They'd have to treat their wastes. They'd have to spread them in a responsible and accountable way. But because we've immunized agriculture essentially from regulation, environmental regulation, we now have allowed it to concentrate into bigger and bigger units. And I'm going to come back to the Inflation Reduction Act and the climate provisions. It's going to get worse. It's going to get worse if we unregulate it, because these combined animal feeding operations across the board, poultry, swine, and dairy, principally, are going to get bigger. There's 70,000 cow dairies in Texas now. There's 20,000 cow dairies in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I mean, they were getting bigger and bigger. Why are they getting bigger? Because they see the opportunity in methane as their profit center. Methane, not meat, not milk, but energy. So in passing an act that's going to put agriculture at the center of American energy production, that's what's happening now. unregulated. Who knows what the outcome of that is going to be environmentally? But I can tell you, based on the record since 1972, it's going to be bad. And they're going to, and again, agriculture is going to hide behind, well, this is the yeoman farmer, when it's not. It's Exxon. It's Chevron. It's Shell. It's, in my state, Consumers Power. What's your big utility? That it's going to, this is serious stuff that's going on right now. It's going to happen really quickly. And we have a responsibility as journalists to kind of get this story out there, right?
So the reason they can get bigger is because we don't regulate pollution. All right? If we didn't have the system of laws or the absence of laws that we have, they couldn't expand the way they have done, right? And so the fact that we don't have laws regulating the pollution has facilitated the enlargement of the individual facilities.
And at this time, at this moment in our development of agriculture, we need a really resilient agriculture, right? Given all of the climate, what I call climate pain, right? With floods or droughts or fires or whatever it's going to be, viruses, right? We need a resilient agriculture. We're making it less resilient. We're making our food production less resilient to those kinds of disruptions now by policy, by policy. And there's so few people thinking about this, really thinking it through.
So you, Keith, you're talking about kind of agriculture being at a crossroads, with electric vehicles. I think that's definitely true. What other factors, such as possibly water shortages in some states, do you think they may force change to our agricultural system, maybe on the crop side?
I hope so. I'm saying that there's ways to disrupt a little bit the system. I really think that putting biodigesters, built by Chevron and operated by utilities is a different animal than what's happening in concentrated animal feeding operations right now. I think there's an opportunity to argue that's a point source. Let's go at it, I really think that's possible, with some smart lawyers doing this. The structure, the institutional structure of American agriculture now is not the yeoman farmer. The yeoman farmer is kind of caught in the system too, right? I was in Minnesota, in southern Minnesota, where townships there have been able to establish regulation on how large their CAFOs can be within that town, within that county. Winona County is particularly. So they limit, let's say, 1,500 cows, can't go above that, and they're sticking to it. They recognized the problem with CAFOs years ago, and they put in place zoning ordinances that you can't have more than 1,500 cows. And I visited a really, really capable farm family there, dairy farm family, that wanted to expand and couldn't. And they're saying, well, we're doing everything right, and we're not going to be polluting the water, and there's no nitrates going on the surface water, no nitrates in the groundwater. And I said to them, but people don't believe you. They don't trust you. You need regulation. You need regulation that says put in monitoring wells, right? Put in a few monitoring wells and prove it. And that farmer, he said, you might be right about that. So in some places, regulation is snaring farmers in real trouble on how they expand their operation. Not very many places. So there's this sort of reverse thing going on too. It's rare, but it's happening. And the Farm Bureau, bless their heart, is busy trying to dismantle that regulatory system. It's happening in Minnesota, it's happening in Wisconsin. The Missouri Supreme Court just outlawed the ability of local townships to regulate CAFO, so there's this back and forth at the local level.
Chris, I want to return to the book for a minute, and I'm sure you've gotten this question in recent months, but I think it's a good one. Do you have a favorite essay in the book, and if so, why?
Yeah, I have some favorites. I think the one, Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Farmers, was probably my best writing, I thought. And I know that was also one of the most hated essays. I like the ones that are the funniest, and so, I thought the propaganda was kind of funny.
How much
know,
did you giggle when you wrote the title 50 Shades of Brown? Is that what it, or?
So here's the deal. I used to work at Iowa Soybean Association, and I did some writing for them. And so like all the ag advocacy organizations, they have a pretty sophisticated communication shop, and they have, you know, magazines and, you know, website and all these other things. And so I did some writing for them, and I wrote a piece on manure, and I wanted to title it 50 Shades of Brown. And this is some time before I came to the University of Iowa, and they said, oh, no, you can't, you can't use that title. So I had thought of the title a long time before that. But, you know, my best title, I thought, was Don't Pee Down My Leg and Tell Me It's Raining. And, you know, that was about, that one was about phosphorus. And so the symbol for phosphorus is P. And of course, don't pee down my leg means don't lie to me, right? And so that was kind of my favorite one.
To what degree do you think humor makes these conversations easier, if at all?
Well, I knew what I was writing was provocative, simply because nobody else was doing it. And so I think that I consciously, you know, especially the last couple years, I didn't write as much or write as many as I did earlier. And when I posted something, I really wanted the quality to be, you know, really good, because I felt like if people that didn't like the content might see the quality, see some quality in the composition, that might buffer me a little bit. And so if they thought, well, I hate that message, but it's decent writing, you know, they would feel more kindly towards me. And so I think the humor part of it was important. And I think, you know, I always felt like a lot of what I was doing was polemics, and these polemicists, a lot of them don't last very long. And so I thought, well, maybe if I got some humor in there, you know, it would inspire people to read them, even though they knew going in that they might not like what I was going to say. And so, you know, I would try to put a joke. I would try to, you know, drag people from joke to joke in the essays, you know, and you know, you have some dense science stuff in between the dumb little jokes, and, you know, maybe that makes it easier. I don't know.
Keith, you know, your writing is more, it's a different sort of writing. It's more serious and doesn't use humor in the same way. But which stories have you found have gotten the most traction, and why do you think they have?
Well, one of the stories that got the most traction is the story I wrote about Chris. He broke that story. So, you know, I interviewed Chris early on in this project, and of course, to talk to Chris is to talk to a master and an expert in all of this stuff. And it's been fun for me and enlightening to see a scientist, Chris is a scientist, sort of recognize that he's playing a different role. And he's so hopelessly Midwestern, you know, self-effacing and modest and humble. And he's hopelessly Midwestern. And to watch him, you know, kind of begin to recognize this new realm that he's entered as kind of an activist writer, right? I mean, and to get comfortable with or uncomfortable. Are you comfortable with that yet?
Well, you know, I get accused. I've had, you know, people in the legislature say, well, he's an activist. And I'd say, well, I hope so, because, you know, as scientists, we're supposed to advocate for what we see as the truth, right? If we're not doing that, then we're not doing our job. And so, you know, am I an advocate or am I an activist? Well, I was trying to advocate for what I saw as the truth about the current condition here.
So that was one story that got a lot of play. You know, that became a big story.
And when you say you wrote about Chris, what can you tell the audience what aspect you wrote about?
Well, I mean, Chris's story is interesting and illustrative and kind of emblematic. So you have a prominent voice, University of Iowa-based blog, really well written, very timely, and very punchy, right? And you also have a scientist recruited from the Soybean Association, specifically to the University of Iowa, to build a monitoring network, a nitrate monitoring network, which started at 12 when he was recruited in 2015, became 66, monitoring stations around the state. And it's, if it's not the best monitoring network in the country, it's one of them, okay? And it's right there on the computer, on the screen. It has its own map. You can see what's happening, okay. And he's writing, and he's got this nitrate monitoring system that shows exactly the proof, the data of what he's writing about. Oh, well, that upsets this, that upsets the institutional powers that don't want to really know that. So we have two lawmakers come out of the Iowa legislature in the spring, early spring of this year, and put a lot of pressure on the University of Iowa to shut that blog down, shut it down. And they say they didn't threaten any monetary fiscal consequences for the university, but I don't believe them. But anyway, the university completely caves. The university says nothing about this, nor does Iowa State say anything about it. This annoys me, the Max. The two, great University of Iowa, the state of sensibility in America, right? This state was, more sensible, or was more sensible than any state in the country. It was its reputation. And so I'm in the middle of this. I'm in the middle of this all of a sudden because Chris lets me know this is happening. And in the first piece I wrote about it, he didn't tell me exactly what was happening. And I was really nice, unusually sympathetic, being a hard-bitten New York Times correspondent, I could have gone and found out the story, but he said, but I put the story together about what really, what was happening. And he retired, and we had this conversation, and he told me he's got this book coming out about his columns. And I'm like, these people are going to unleash you when you're having a book coming out? It's like, what do they think is going to happen? And the book, and he gave me a copy of his book, and it's awesome. I mean, if you haven't read it, it's awesome. And for a journalist, it's like a treasure trove of leads and data. Anyway, so I wrote the first piece on my blog, and Bill McKibben picked it up on his Substack. Bill McKibben, know Bill McKibben, activist, climate, he's the greatest environmental journalist of my generation. He picked it up and published it, and it got out there. And then I wrote a second piece that kind of explained what was happening. But others were writing about this. This story became an important story about the power and disruption, the power of big ag interests to put pressure on major universities to basically silence an important voice. And that happened, and here he is, but they didn't silence him. In fact, it elevated his voice. It had the opposite effect. It put more attention on this story and on Chris than they could have possibly imagined.
Yeah, so when I retired, and I told my boss this, I really did not want to be seen as somebody that had an axe to grind. And I just did not want to leave my job, with that sort of cloud or stink or whatever it might be. And, I said, I don't want to burn anything down. I said, I have a book. I'm happy I've got a book. I had a nice career. I got to do a lot of different things in my career. And so I still don't want to be seen as this person that, had an axe to grind here. I just wanted to do what I wanted, what I was doing, right? And I knew someday it might come to an end, and that day came. And so I just wanted to, leave. And, but, the stuff that was happening in the legislature, just sort of, blew up, and, here we are.
So you asked me another piece that I really like in this series. By the way, this series that I'm writing is called Toxic Terrain, and it's being on Circle of Blue, and you can find it on the New Lead. And the series is being edited by Carrie Williams. She's the managing editor of the New Lead. She's a Kansas-based journalist. She's top-notch. She's doing a great job. So that's in Toxic Terrain. One of the important stories, again, Iowa's in the middle of this, and Iowa State's in the middle of this whole issue. In the 80s, Iowa State in the 90s. Iowa State had a really capable agronomist. His name was Fred Blackmer. And, you know, in the 80s and the 70s and certainly through the 90s, Iowa was getting knowledge, becoming more aware of the consequences of this industrial farming system on water quality in this state. And Fred Blackmer got really involved, and he produced, and this is a short story, but he produced a thing called the early spring nitrate test. And the early spring nitrate test is designed to reduce the amount of nitrogen, chemical fertilizers you put on your ground, and manure. And it was eloquent in its simplicity, and you test the soil and you do some other things when the corn is about that big in the field. Now, I understand that it can be wet and it can be hard to get in there and all the rest, but that's what he did. And basically his data showed that you could put half or less of chemical fertilizer on your crop and not affect your yields, right? That's important. And these graphs are famous, you know, they have graphs that show, they go like this. So you hit, this is production, right? That's the yield, right? So that's that corn. And then on the bottom is how much fertilizer you put on. And so this yield goes like this, and at about 80 pounds, you know, it starts to level out. Well, that 80 and 180 pounds per acre is basically the same line. This is famous in the nitrogen corn fertilizing, you know, playbook. Iowa State just shelved that stuff. I mean, after dozens and dozens and dozens of field tests that said it works. Well, who does that help? Well, it helps the $28 billion fertilizer industry, and it helps the equipment makers, but it doesn't help the environment nor public health, because there's a level at which putting more nitrogen on doesn't make a difference, doesn't make any difference. And Iowa State has known this for decades, and so does Minnesota, and so does Missouri. But we decide, as an industry, we decide not to apply it. So this is not rocket science to solve this. It really isn't. It amounts to reducing how much stuff gets into water, and that means reducing your fertilizer and manure applications, doing more elegant and responsible things with how you manage your farm.
All right, I'm going to jump in. Okay, I want to we've got a lot of great questions coming up here, thank you, and I want to get to those in a moment, but given the sway that Republicans hold over the Iowa legislature, I mean, it's undeniable what the political environment is like right now. And they're writing the laws basically without any input from Democrats because they have the numbers and they're deciding what funding goes to the DNR and other regulators. How do you start a conversation about water quality that can include the right in Iowa?
Well, firstly, I want to say Democrats haven't exactly been great on this issue either. And so, and I say all the time, you know, don't think you can just drag your body into a voting booth and check a box and that's going to produce better water, because, you know, that's not going to happen. You know, how can you include the political right on this? Well, you know, what I say is, look what's happened to rural Iowa over the last 50 years with consolidation in agriculture, especially in the livestock industry. And so we have 70 counties that are losing population. I grew up here. I remember small towns in Iowa being, you know, prosperous places. You know, my folks were from Knoxville, Iowa, and I had a number of relatives in southern Iowa, and I mean, those towns have completely changed, right? And not many of them look very prosperous anymore. And so these rural counties, right, they vote Republican, we all know that. And so I think what we need to do is to sort of tie these issues together, that this decay in rural Iowa is, or the pollution that we see from agriculture and as a result of consolidation in agriculture, is part and parcel of the decay of rural Iowa. I mean, there's just no doubt in my mind about that. And so we have 7,000 private wells here in Iowa that have been contaminated with nitrate since the year 2000, 7,000 wells. Well, guess what? Those wells aren't in Polk County. They're not in Johnson County. They're in Louisa County, and they're in Cherokee County, and they're in Alameda County, and all these rural counties. And so the burden of this pollution at least from an economic perspective, falls mainly on rural people. And so I think that is a discussion that needs to be had. But I just am so frustrated that Democrats do not have the courage to talk about this stuff. They just don't. And so when you look at their TV commercials when they're running for office, look at who's running as a Democrat in our congressional district, Christina Bohannon, a law professor at the University of Iowa. You would think this would be the most liberal candidate, you know. Well, look, when she ran the last time after time, I'd see her TV commercials. She was wearing Carhartts and walking across the farmyard of some millionaire farmer. And so we just don't have the courage. The Democrats just do not have the courage to address this and take it to the rural people. Why, I do not know.
All right, well, we have so many good questions here, so we're going to kind of pivot to that to try to answer some of these here. It's a really good one. Are there any states that are regulating ag better than we're doing here? Where can we get some good examples?
Well, Minnesota does have the 50-foot buffer law that I said. They require a 50-foot perennial cover on each side of perennial streams, and they also have some rules regarding nitrogen application in the areas where groundwater has been demonstrated to be polluted with nitrate.
The institutional response to this over the last 30 years is basically built on two of three legs of a stool. So the states and the federal government have done a lot of science. Billions of dollars have been spent on science to understand what the problem is and where the source is and what the consequences are, particularly environmentally. There's a lot of money being spent by foundations and some states and the federal government on convening. So counties talk to states, states talk to states, the U.S. talks to Canada. There's a lot of convening around. There's conferences on this. But the third stool, the third leg, is where phosphorus and nitrogen nitrates get into water. That's not happening. It's just not happening in any kind of substantive way anywhere in the country. And the last piece of this, the Congress, Democrats and Republicans, that for years have thought that we can solve this by voluntarily encouraging farmers to have best management practices. So this is buffer streams, this is cover crops, this is no-till, this is a bunch of other stuff. It doesn't work. It doesn't work, and it's not very popular among farmers. I mean, some small percentage, 10%, cover crops, some small percentage, will buffer their streams. We're spending, before this current bill happening, $5 billion a year. $5 billion a year on best management practices. A lot of that in the Corn Belt and a bunch of others in the Great Lakes region. It's not working, So we have a new farm bill coming out here in the next couple of months. We need to rethink, if it's going to be voluntary, we need to find much more effective ways to encourage farmers to be more responsible and accountable to wastes. Or I shouldn't say farmers, agriculture. I'll say agriculture, to encourage agriculture to be more responsible.
Okay, this is a question that goes back to this. Can we build on any regulatory successes in Europe or other countries?
Well, we can build on regulatory successes we've had here, and that was in the 1985 Farm Bill. We had conservation compliance. And so we required farmers that were farming on highly erodible land, which we have a lot of in Iowa, to have a soil conservation plan if they wanted to participate in the federal farm programs. That worked. We know that it worked. We know the clarity of Iowa streams improved after conservation compliance became the law. And so we need conservation compliance for nutrient pollution as a start.
A couple of these questions, several questions are related to regenerative practices. Folks are asking if you guys have a sense of what share of Iowa farmers are using some of these successful strategies, and is there a way, or another question, is there a way that these stream buffers could be incentivized through financially?
So we know about 30% of our acres are in no-till, and that doesn't mean that they're never tilled. That means it's no-till, and so oftentimes the soybean crop will be no-till, but the corn crop is tilled. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% in cover crops. That might be the high end. They exaggerate this number quite a bit, and so, those are maybe our two main things. The incentivize the buffer strips, I tell people, look, I'm just done with that. I just am, we've tried and tried. We have spent, as taxpayers, billions of dollars on soil conservation. The federal government has spent about on the order of $800 for every person that's ever lived in the United States since the 1930s on soil conservation, giving money to farmers. And we still don't have the environmental outcomes that we want. And so I'm just done talking about this incentivizing, which means paying them. And we need laws.
The climate change provisions of the Inflation, last year, Tom Vilsack, Ag Secretary, your former governor, and the Farm Bureau, and the Environmental Defense Fund, and a bunch of other folks put together a thing called Climate Smart Agriculture. And basically, it's a big sop to major producers. Big chicken growers got $90 million grants to be climate smart agriculture. But that program includes about $500 million for regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, organic agriculture. It's the biggest investment in the history of the United States in that realm of agriculture. So, there is hope there, but those are small farms. I mean, that's a small portion of production, growing, important in cities, but not the source of what we're talking about. It's a help.
So a question that comes back to anaerobic digesters, and these are digesters that animal manure is put in, lots of times with food waste. There's a chemical process. I've heard it described as like a bovine stomach, these big digesting tanks. Keith, you mentioned that they produce digestate. I've heard digestate described as more of a dry product. You're saying it's liquid. Audience member wants to know exactly what the products are that they're coming out of these digesters and what can be done with them, and is it different from just raw manure?
All right, I haven't studied this because I'm working on a piece about this, and I'm not an expert on the chemical constituencies of digestate. It can be dry, it can be liquid. What I know is that it comes out in a more concentrated form for nitrogen and for phosphorus. It will kill E. coli because it's a heated project, but it also has, more antibiotics in it, concentrates those. It also has more of the drugs that are applied to animals to keep them alive. So I can't answer that question.
So so it's been stabilized, what we call stabilized, and so by that, a lot of the ammonia in the waste has been converted to nitrate, and then, as Keith said, the pathogens die in the process, and the volume of material is reduced, so presumably it's easier to handle. The issue is this is being sold as an environmental solution, and we have an excess of nutrients on our landscape, right? That's why we have nutrient pollution, and the digesters do nothing to address that. The amount of nutrient in the waste is not reduced by the digester.
All right, we're going to make this our last question because I think it's one a lot of people have. I have 3 cards that all have questions about this. People in the audience and people out in Iowa want to know what they can do. Do voters, how do we vote for regulation? Is there a way to do that? What can we do to change the pollution of our water? How can we get regulation? What's the number one thing Iowans can do to improve our water, air, and soil?
Well, as we said, the legislature is kind of a non-starter right now. But, the legislature's not the only governmental body we have in Iowa. And so every county has county supervisors, right? Well, who has jurisdiction over the rural land where all this pollution is coming from? Well, of course, it's the county supervisors. We have these drainage districts. We have 3,000 drainage districts in Iowa that oversee the tile drainage infrastructure. In most cases, the county supervisors oversee these drainage districts. And so people need to agitate with the county supervisors about clean water. And so just as an example, why couldn't Johnson County condemn the first 50 feet on each side of all our perennial streams? You know, it's not that much land. It's not financially impossible. Well, imagine that in Johnson County, if the first 50 feet on each side of a perennial stream was all park. People would go bonkers over that idea. I mean, imagine the river access and the bike trails and camping and bird watching. People would love it. And so why can't we do that? You know, as far as I know, county supervisors have the authority to condemn land, right? So why don't we do that? A lot of our cities are really complicit with what's going on with this ag pollution. Look at the city of Cedar Rapids. What do they have up there? ADM, Cargill, big ethanol plant, right? They all see those jobs as, a positive for the city of Cedar Rapids. So the city really toes the line on a lot of this ag pollution stuff. If you read what Erin and others have written about Cedar Rapids. And so we need to agitate with the city councils and tell them, look, this is the change that we want. And we know the legislature's a dead end. And in many of these cities, these are our liberal politicians. We need to create an expectation.
Keith, would you add anything just about what people can do to improve the water quality?
I mean, all this change starts with people, in the meetings, in the places that matter, where people are meeting. And, you're seeing it here over the carbon pipelines. The carbon pipelines are a response, again, to the infrastructure law of November 2021, $20 billion is going into carbon pipelines. And what's that about? So that's linked up with ethanol plants, right? Ethanol plants produce a pretty pure CO2 stream out of their stacks. And so Congress, in its infinite wisdom, said, well, we'll try to capture that and put it in the ground, carbon sequestration. It's a climate pain reduction mechanism. Well, people in Iowa recognize that may be a risk and are agitating about it. And look how far that campaign, that's spread to Wisconsin, it's spread to Minnesota. Which one? North Dakota just said, we're not going to allow these pipelines. So the power of people to agitate and to focus. Now, this is hard stuff. I started a land use group in Michigan in 1995 and worked this process. The process, we're all about process. Well, the process works if you put enough pressure on the process. Citizens organized can put as much pressure on the process as any company or any industry if they're in the process. So I'm saying again, that when a biodigester is coming to a CAFO here, get involved. Ask questions. How are you going to regulate it? What are we going to do? Be expert. It's hard work. I get it. It's hard work, but that is a place to enter. CO2 pipelines. Whoever recognized in Iowa, CO2 pipelines have become an issue. Well, it's an issue. It's a really important issue here because people are in the process.
I know you want to ask another question, but I want to tell this story. At one of my events, so in my book, I quote Howard Zinn quite a lot. And at one of my events, a woman came up to me or said during the meeting, that she had met Howard Zinn. And she was had gone to the University of Wisconsin, and he had come there to speak. And she said, one thing he said impressed upon me was, everybody thought the civil rights movement started when Rosa Parks got on the bus. And he said, no, people were meeting in churches and schools and people's homes for 15 or 20 years before that, right? And they set the stage for Rosa Parks to be able to get on that bus. And so that's, the sort of thing. I think this totally is a social justice issue here, right? This clean water. As citizens, we think we have a right to it. That's why you're here. And so that's the sort of thing we need.
Well, my last question was just going to give you the last word, so I think you did a really good job with that. Yeah. So I just, want to wrap up. I really appreciate all of you being here and joining in this conversation and asking great questions. And Chris's book, Swine Republic, is for sale in the back. It's great. I've read it, and there's just a lot of entertaining but so richly written essays. So thank you so much for being here, and thanks to our guests, Chris and Keith.